The roar of motorcycle engines cut through the air, loud and unforgiving. The scene in front of the Royal Guards was unlike anything anyone had seen before. Their leader, Captain James Thornton, stood frozen, his eyes locked on the bikers who had just crossed a line. The Royal Guards, known for their stoic and disciplined nature, had never broken character in front of anyone, especially not in front of a crowd. But today was different. The bikers had gone too far. In an instant, Captain Thornton's calm demeanor shattered. The guards, tall, strong, and silent, shifted, their bodies tense, ready to act. The bikers had mocked their leader, made crude jokes, and pushed him to the edge. When one of the bikers shoved him to the ground, something snapped. The Royal Guards, those immovable figures known for their unwavering silence, were now shaking with rage. They moved as one, their military precision suddenly disrupted by something much fiercer. It was over in seconds. Their cocky smirks wiped off their faces. The Royal Guards had broken character, but it was the bikers who would regret it. What happened next was something no one expected, least of all the bikers who had dared to challenge them. As Captain Thornton stood brushing dirt from his uniform, the silence that followed was deafening. The bikers, still reeling from the unexpected retaliation, exchanged nervous glances. And then, in a split second, Captain Thornton spoke, his voice low and cold. "You've made a mistake. You won't get away with this." The bikers, now visibly rattled, didn't know what to do. What had just happened, and why had the Royal Guards reacted like this? The entire crowd was silent, waiting for what would come next. But as Captain Thornton turned to face his team, they realized that something even more dangerous than a few bikers was about to unfold. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about sending a message. What the bikers didn't know was that they had crossed a line no one should have crossed, and the Royal Guards, they would make sure everyone knew it. Earlier that day, in the heart of the city, the Royal Guards were doing what they did best, standing watch outside the royal palace. Their uniforms were immaculate, their posture perfect. Captain James Thornton, a tall man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, led his team with an almost eerie quietness. He had been a Royal Guard for over 15 years, and in that time he had seen everything from protests to foreign dignitaries arriving. But nothing had ever made him question his loyalty to his country or his role in this elite unit. The Royal Guards had earned their reputation. They were silent, they were steadfast, they were unwavering. No matter what happened around them, they stood tall, never betraying an emotion. They were the epitome of discipline. But on that particular afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky and the heat from the concrete was starting to fade, a group of bikers came speeding down the street. Their loud engines and bright leather jackets were impossible to miss. The group was a familiar one, locals known for their reckless behavior and lack of respect for authority. They were always looking for trouble, but this time they'd gone too far. The bikers were making a show of it. They revved their engines right next to the Royal Guards, mocking them, taunting them. Some even had the audacity to take pictures of them. Captain Thornton's eyes narrowed. He kept his posture straight, his hands behind his back, but inside he could feel a rising tension. The Royal Guards had been the subject of mockery before, but this was different. This wasn't just a disrespectful shout or a rude gesture. The bikers were mocking the very essence of who they were. One of the bikers, a man named Tony, rode his motorcycle up to the front of the guards and stopped. He pulled off his helmet, revealing a scruffy face and a cocky grin. "Hey, Captain, are you guys always this stiff?" Tony sneered. "What's it like living in the past? Does your uniform come with a time machine?" A few of his friends laughed, but Captain Thornton didn't flinch. He stood motionless, staring at Tony with cold, calculating eyes. The other guards remained perfectly still as well. They had been trained for situations like this. They were used to insults, but then something changed. Tony got off his bike and walked up to the captain, his boots scuffing against the pavement. He was getting too close, too personal. "I heard you guys can't even smile," Tony said with a laugh. "Must be nice to be so perfect." He reached out to tap Captain Thornton on the shoulder, a challenge in itself. The moment Tony's hand made contact, something inside Captain Thornton snapped. He had endured years of taunts, threats, and insults, but this was different. This man wasn't just mocking them, he was mocking everything they stood for. Before anyone could react, Captain Thornton moved faster than anyone expected. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Tony's wrist and twisted it behind his back. The biker yelped in pain, but Thornton's grip was unrelenting. The other guards stepped forward. They moved as one, a single, well-oiled machine surrounding the bikers. The tension in the air was palpable. The bikers didn't know what to do. They had crossed a line, and now the consequences were coming. Tony struggled in Captain Thornton's grasp, but the captain only tightened his hold. "You don't touch me, and you don't touch my team," he said in a low, controlled voice. "Understand?" Tony, still wincing in pain, nodded. He had underestimated the Royal Guards, and now he was paying for it. The other bikers stood frozen, staring in disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before. The Royal Guards were supposed to be untouchable, statuesque figures of strength, but this was different. This was personal. Captain Thornton released Tony, shoving him back toward his bike. The biker stumbled but didn't fall, his friends now looking at him with concern. "Get out of here," Captain Thornton said, his voice sharp. Tony didn't hesitate. He mounted his bike and revved the engine, signaling his friends to follow. They all sped off, leaving the scene in a blur of exhaust fumes and rubber. The Royal Guard stood still, silent once more, but inside Captain Thornton knew that this wasn't over. He turned to his team. "Stay alert," he said, his voice cold. "We've made our point, but I have a feeling they won't let it go." The Royal Guards resumed their positions, but the unease lingered in the air. The bikers weren't done yet, and neither were they. Little did Captain Thornton know, the bikers would return soon, and when they did, things would spiral into something far more dangerous than anyone could have anticipated. The Royal Guards had broken their character once, but what would happen when they were forced to do it again? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The Royal Guards remained in their positions, unmoving, while the last light of day slowly disappeared. Captain Thornton couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The events of earlier still buzzed in his mind. The bikers had backed down, but that didn't sit well with him. The way they had looked at him, their eyes full of contempt, he knew they would be back. He glanced at his team, each of them standing tall and silent just as they were trained to, but even they couldn't hide the flicker of tension in their posture. "Stay sharp," Captain Thornton murmured under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure his men or himself. The city streets were quiet now, the bustle of the afternoon replaced with the eerie calm of evening. But Thornton couldn't relax, not yet. He had seen enough in his years as a Royal Guard to know when something was off. The bikers weren't just a nuisance, they were a problem. And problems like this rarely disappeared quietly. An hour later, the peace was shattered. The roar of motorcycle engines once again filled the air, cutting through the night like thunder. Captain Thornton's head snapped up, his instincts kicking in. "They're back," he said, his voice low but steady. The sound of the bikes grew louder, approaching the square where the guards stood watch. Thornton could hear the screech of tires on asphalt, the unmistakable sound of a motorcycle making a hard turn. He looked around. The other guards stood motionless, but their eyes were alert, tracking the approaching sound. Then the bikers appeared, but this time there was something different about them. They were no longer just a small group of men looking for a laugh. There were more of them now, at least a dozen bikes roaring toward the palace. As the motorcycles slowed to a stop, Captain Thornton's jaw clenched. The bikers circled the square, revving their engines and honking their horns, as if daring the Royal Guards to do something. Their leader, Tony, was at the front, his face twisted into a sneer. Thornton could see the shift in his eyes. The same arrogance was there, but now it was mixed with a sense of recklessness. The man wasn't here just to taunt anymore. He was here to prove something. Tony dismounted from his bike, walking toward Captain Thornton with a swagger. His friends followed, each of them staring the guards down as though daring them to make the first move. "You guys think you're above everyone, huh?" Tony called out, his voice loud and taunting. "Well, I don't take kindly to being pushed around." He pointed directly at Captain Thornton. "You embarrassed me earlier, but now it's your turn. Show me what you've got." Thornton's eyes narrowed. The bikers had come looking for a fight. This wasn't about teasing the Royal Guards anymore, this was personal. And for the first time in years, the captain felt the familiar stirrings of anger in his chest. He had always prided himself on his restraint, on his ability to stay calm and in control, but now, standing face to face with this man who had crossed so many lines, it was hard to keep that control intact. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his role as captain. He couldn't let the situation escalate, not without reason. He had a duty to protect the palace, to ensure peace in the city. But Tony wasn't interested in peace, and neither were the rest of the bikers. Without warning, Tony reached into his jacket and pulled out a large, sharpened knife. The gleam of steel in the streetlight sent a wave of shock through the Royal Guards. It wasn't just a challenge anymore, it was a threat. "Are you going to stand there like statues, or are you going to do something?" Tony shouted, waving the knife in the air. Thornton could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't a situation that could be talked through. The bikers weren't going to back down, and if they had a weapon... For a split second, Captain Thornton's mind raced. He knew he had no choice but to act, but this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The bikers were reckless, yes, but they were also unpredictable. They had the advantage of numbers and the element of surprise, but the Royal Guards had something the bikers didn't: training, discipline, and the kind of strength that could take down any opponent if they were pushed to their limits. Thornton stepped forward, his voice steady despite the rising adrenaline in his veins. "Put the knife down, Tony," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't the way to settle this." Tony's laugh was loud, mocking. "You think I'm scared of you and your little toys? You're nothing but a joke in these suits." The other bikers circled around, egging Tony on, their taunts echoing in the square. But it was Tony's words that cut the deepest. To them, the Royal Guards were nothing more than a spectacle, a sideshow act for the tourists and onlookers. They didn't see the years of training, the sacrifice, or the dedication that went into every move the guards made. Tony took another step forward, the knife gleaming in the moonlight. "What's it going to be, Captain? You want to prove you're tougher than me? Let's see if you can actually fight." The crowd of bikers cheered, their voices rising in a dangerous crescendo. Tony was no longer just challenging Captain Thornton. He was challenging the entire reputation of the Royal Guards. Captain Thornton knew the moment for words was over. Without a second thought, he moved. In one fluid motion, he drew his baton from his side and swung it with precision, knocking the knife from Tony's hand. The sound of metal hitting concrete echoed across the square. Tony stumbled back, surprised by the speed and power behind the strike. But he recovered quickly, fury flashing in his eyes. The other bikers moved in, their faces contorted with anger, ready to back their leader. But Captain Thornton wasn't alone. The Royal Guards moved as one, their training kicking in. They spread out in perfect formation, closing in on the bikers. Each move was deliberate, practiced, but now there was an edge of violence to it. They weren't just defending anymore, they were fighting back. Tony, realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, shouted at his crew, "Hit them! Don't let them get away with this!" The bikers lunged forward, swinging punches, kicking at the guards, but Thornton and his team were ready. Every punch they threw was met with a precise block. Every kick was countered with a swift move. It wasn't long before the bikers began to realize they had made a huge mistake. But just as it seemed like the Royal Guards had gained control, something unexpected happened. From the back of the group, one of the bikers who had been quietly watching the fight unfold pulled out a gun. Time seemed to stop. The Royal Guards froze for just a second, unsure of what would happen next. Would this be the moment that everything changed? The cold metal of the gun glinted under the streetlights as the biker slowly raised it toward Captain Thornton. The tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The roar of the engines and the shouting of the bikers faded into a distant buzz, leaving only the unmistakable click of the gun's hammer being pulled back. Thornton's heart raced, but he didn't move. The Royal Guards were trained for all kinds of threats, but this was a situation unlike anything they had faced before. A weapon, a gun, was a game changer. "Don't do it," Captain Thornton said, his voice low but firm. He wasn't talking to the bikers, he wasn't talking to the gunmen, he was talking to himself. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not when everything was on the edge of tipping over. The biker's hand shook slightly, but his eyes were locked onto the captain. "You made a big mistake messing with us," he spat, his words slurred with anger. "This is how we settle scores." Thornton glanced at his men. They had formed a loose perimeter around the bikers, but they were waiting for his command. They knew as well as he did that this wasn't just about physical strength anymore. It was about managing the situation before it escalated further. The moment the gun was in play, everything changed. "Put the gun down and we can walk away from this," Thornton said, his voice steady even though his muscles were coiled tight, ready to react. The biker's eyes flickered to the Royal Guards, then back at the captain. His grip tightened on the gun, but something in his expression shifted. Maybe it was the calm authority in Thornton's voice, or maybe it was the fact that the Royal Guards hadn't flinched, hadn't wavered in the face of such danger, whatever it was. The biker hesitated, just for a moment. That moment was all it took. Without warning, one of Thornton's men, Corporal Samuel Green, moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Green, always the quickest on his feet, lunged forward in one swift motion. His baton struck the gunman's wrist with precision, knocking the weapon to the ground with a sharp clang. The gun skittered across the pavement, out of reach. The biker, still in shock from the speed of the attack, was grabbed by two other guards and pulled to the ground, his face slamming into the concrete. For a moment, everything was silent again. The bikers froze, some still eyeing the royal guards, others glancing at their fallen friend. Tony, the leader, stood apart from the group, his fists clenched. He seemed to hesitate, as though calculating what to do next. The other bikers weren't sure whether to fight, run, or surrender. "That's enough," Captain Thornton said, his voice rising just enough to be heard. He stepped forward, his baton still gripped firmly in his hand. He looked at the biker on the ground, whose face was now pressed into the street, hands restrained behind his back. "You can walk away right now, or you can face the consequences of your actions." The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of more violence. But then something unexpected happened. Tony took a step back, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. "We're done," he muttered, his voice shaky but defiant. "We don't need to do this anymore." The other bikers exchanged uncertain glances. It was clear they had never expected the situation to spiral this far out of control. They had taunted the royal guards, pushed their buttons, but now they saw what happened when they pushed too hard. Tony, realizing the fight was over, nodded curtly to his crew. "Let's go, now!" With that, the bikers retreated, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. They mounted their motorcycles and revved their engines. The sound of the bikes roaring to life broke the silence, and within moments, the group of troublemakers was gone, fading into the night. Captain Thornton and his team stood motionless, still on high alert. They didn't move until the last echo of motorcycle engines had disappeared completely. Thornton exhaled deeply, the tension in his chest slowly easing. It wasn't over, he knew that, but for now, the immediate threat had passed. "Corporal Green, secure the gun," Thornton ordered, his voice still steady but with a sharp edge. "The rest of you stay alert. I want a full sweep of the area." An hour later, the royal guards were back in their positions outside the palace, the quiet of the night settling around them again. But Captain Thornton couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was too easy. The bikers had left without a real fight, without pushing the situation further. He couldn't help but wonder if they had been planning something else, something more dangerous. "Captain!" Corporal Green spoke up, his voice breaking through Thornton's thoughts. "We've got a situation." Thornton turned, his eyes narrowing as Green handed him a small folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words written hastily in what looked like red marker. "You've made your point, but we're not finished. Tonight was just the beginning. You'll regret crossing us." Thornton's stomach dropped as he read the message. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The bikers weren't done with them. In fact, this felt like a warning. "Get me intel on every one of them, now," Thornton ordered, his voice colder than it had been all night. "We're not waiting for them to make the next move. We're going to make ours first." As the royal guards resumed their watch, Captain Thornton's mind raced. He couldn't afford to wait. He knew the bikers weren't just acting out of anger anymore. They were on a mission, and it was a mission that would bring more chaos to the city if it wasn't stopped. But what if the bikers had more than just threats? What if this was only the beginning of something far worse? Thornton stared out into the night, his thoughts clouded with uncertainty. The royal guards had always been the last line of defense, but now it seemed like they were in over their heads. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The night stretched on, but the peace Captain Thornton had hoped would return remained elusive. Every corner of the city seemed to hum with the possibility of something more. Even as he stood there, gazing into the dimly lit streets beyond the palace gates, his mind was sharp and restless. The bikers were still out there somewhere, and the cryptic message they'd left behind made his blood run cold. He paced back and forth, his mind working over every possibility. "It's not just the bikers. They're part of something bigger," he muttered to himself, running his fingers through his hair. The more he thought about the warning, the clearer it became. This wasn't a simple grudge. It wasn't a random act of disrespect. Something far more organized and dangerous was unfolding. "Captain," Corporal Green interrupted his thoughts, stepping forward with a grim expression. "I've got something you need to see." Thornton's pulse quickened as he followed Green to the far end of the square, where a nearby security monitor flickered to life. The images on the screen were grainy, but there was no mistaking what they showed. Several bikers entering a warehouse on the edge of town. The place was isolated, just the kind of location where plans could be made without anyone noticing. "They're meeting up," Green said, "and I think we've just found their base." Thornton's eyes narrowed. This was it. The Royal Guards had been tasked with guarding the palace, but it seemed they were being drawn into something much darker, something that could threaten the city itself. He turned to Green. "Get me the full team, we're moving out." The air was cooler now, the last remnants of daylight fading into the shadows of the night. The Royal Guards moved swiftly, their steps light but deliberate as they approached the warehouse. It was located on a stretch of road that had once been a bustling industrial district, but had long since fallen into disrepair. Now it was home to nothing but abandoned buildings and empty streets, perfect for the bikers to hide in plain sight. As they neared the warehouse, Captain Thornton gestured for the guards to spread out. He had no idea what he would find inside, but he couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. They'd already made their presence known once. There was no telling what the bikers might do next. They moved in close, the shadows concealing them as they positioned themselves near the warehouse's rear entrance. The flickering light inside gave the place an eerie atmosphere, casting strange shapes across the cracked pavement. "On my mark," Thornton whispered, his voice steady as always, his hand hovering near his baton, ready to act at a moment's notice. There was a loud crash from inside the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door being slammed shut. The Royal Guards tensed, their bodies coiled and ready. Thornton motioned for them to move in. He crept forward, his eyes scanning every possible escape route. They couldn't afford to let anyone slip away if they wanted answers, and possibly to prevent an even bigger threat, they had to act fast. Just as they reached the door, a voice from within called out, harsh and low, "They're here!" "Get ready." The words sent a chill down Thornton's spine. It wasn't just the bikers. Whoever was behind this had been expecting them. There was no time to waste. Thornton didn't hesitate. He kicked open the door with a force that sent it crashing against the wall. The Royal Guards stormed inside, their batons raised and ready for whatever lay ahead. The scene inside was unlike anything they had expected. The warehouse was filled with large crates, some of them stacked high, others pushed against the walls. But it wasn't the crates that caught their attention. It was the group of bikers gathered around a large table in the center of the room. And it wasn't just bikers. There were several men in suits, black suits, with the kind of cold, calculating expressions that sent a shiver down Thornton's spine, the kind of men who didn't belong in a place like this. They looked out of place among the leather jackets and rough attitudes of the bikers. "Captain Thornton," one of the men in a suit said, his voice smooth but condescending. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smirked, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the table. "I think you already know the answer to that, don't you?" Before Thornton could respond, Tony, the leader of the bikers, stepped forward. His face was bruised from the earlier encounter, but his eyes gleamed with a new kind of determination. "This isn't just about us anymore, Captain. We're part of something much bigger." Thornton's gut twisted. "What's going on here?" Tony laughed, though it was a hollow sound. "You've been following the wrong trail. It's not about the bikers. It's about who we're working with. And trust me, you don't want to mess with them." Thornton's mind raced. The message they had found earlier had been only the beginning. The bikers weren't acting alone. They were working for someone, and that someone was someone with power. The man in the suit who had spoken earlier leaned in slightly. "You're in over your head, Captain. The Royal Guards were never meant to handle something like this." Thornton's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a street gang. This was a network, one that was about to make a huge impact on the city. The Royal Guards had always dealt with the occasional threat, but this was something else. They were facing an organized operation that stretched far beyond their training. As the tension in the room grew, a sound cut through the air, a low rumbling noise that seemed to grow louder and louder. The man in the suit's eyes flicked to the door, a flicker of concern passing over his face. "They're here," he said quietly. "And I don't think we'll be able to get out of this one so easily." The noise grew louder still, until suddenly the warehouse door exploded inward, splintering into pieces as a large group of armed men stormed into the building. For a moment, everything was chaos. The bikers scrambled for their bikes, the suited men dove for cover, and the Royal Guards found themselves in the middle of an all-out firefight. Thornton's instincts kicked in, and he moved quickly, pushing his team into defensive positions. His mind raced, but he kept his composure, focusing on the task at hand. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. The Royal Guards had been pulled into a battle they hadn't anticipated, and they were now facing an enemy that wasn't just a group of angry bikers. This was war. The explosion of gunfire filled the air, deafening and chaotic. The Royal Guards dove for cover as the armed men stormed into the warehouse. The bright flash of muzzle fire lit up the room, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "Stay down," Captain Thornton barked to his team, his voice cutting through the noise. "Don't engage unless you have no choice." The Royal Guards took cover behind crates and steel beams, trying to make sense of the madness around them. The bikers, caught off guard by the sudden ambush, scattered, some diving for their bikes, others ducking for safety. But it was clear that the armed men weren't here for the bikers. They were here for the Royal Guards. Thornton's mind raced as he surveyed the situation. The armed men moved with military precision, spreading out across the room in formation, flanking the guards and cutting off any escape routes. It wasn't just a random gang of thugs. These were professionals. They were coordinated, disciplined, and worse, they seemed to know exactly who they were after. Tony, the leader of the bikers, had barely gotten on his bike when the firefight began. He swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a bullet that whisked past his head. He skidded to a halt, cursing under his breath, and then quickly dismounted, rushing to the nearest cover. "This isn't our fight anymore," Tony shouted to Captain Thornton, his voice hoarse with panic. These guys are serious. They don't care about us. They're here for you." Thornton didn't have time to process the words. He was too busy assessing the threat in front of him. The gunfire was steady now, coming from all sides. The armed men had surrounded the warehouse, and more of them were pouring in from the back entrance. They weren't just here to take out the Royal Guards. They were here to eliminate them entirely. "Green, take point," Thornton shouted. "The rest of you, cover our flanks. We're not leaving here until we know who's behind this." But just as he gave the command, a loud explosion erupted from the back of the warehouse. The shockwave slammed into Thornton's chest, throwing him back against a crate. His ears rang, and for a moment everything seemed to blur. His vision swam as the warehouse spun around him. "Captain!" Corporal Green yelled, rushing to Thornton's side. Thornton staggered to his feet, shaken but alive. "We need to move now," he barked, shaking off the dizziness. The explosion had clearly been a diversion, something to draw their attention while the real objective unfolded. He grabbed his radio, his fingers stiff from the shock. "This is Captain Thornton. We need reinforcements now. This is bigger than we thought." The response crackled in his earpiece, but the voice that came through wasn't the one he expected. "Captain, this is Sergeant Hayes. We've lost contact with the rest of the city. No one can get through to us." Thornton's heart sank. "What do you mean, lost contact? Get me a line to command." "Negative, sir," Hayes replied. "All lines are down. Something's blocking the signal. You're on your own." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The armed men, whoever they were, hadn't just come for the Royal Guards. They were making sure there would be no outside help, no backup, no way to warn the city. "We're going to need to handle this ourselves," Thornton said, his voice grim. He motioned for Green to follow him, and together they began moving toward the center of the warehouse where the gunfire was coming from thick. Meanwhile, Tony was crouched behind an overturned crate, trying to make sense of the situation. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched the Royal Guards fight for their lives. The bikers, most of them now huddled behind whatever cover they could find, had no idea what to do next. They had been in plenty of brawls before, but this was a whole different level. These weren't just street thugs. They were highly trained soldiers, and the bikers were out of their league. Tony glanced at the others. "We need to get out of here. This isn't worth it. We've crossed the line." But one of the bikers, a younger guy with tattoos covering both arms, shook his head. "What? You're just going to leave them to get wiped out after everything we've done?" Tony's expression was hard, his jaw clenched. "I don't care about what we've done. These guys will kill us if we stay." The young biker's eyes burned with anger. "Then we fight. I don't know about you, but I'm not running." Tony's gaze flicked over to Captain Thornton, who was coordinating his team, moving through the firefight with a calm efficiency that Tony couldn't help but respect. Maybe it was that respect, or maybe it was just the way things had gotten completely out of control. but something inside Tony snapped. He wasn't going to run, not anymore. "Fine," Tony growled. "We'll help them, but we stick together, understand?" The young biker nodded, grinning. "You got it, boss." As the Royal Guards fought their way deeper into the warehouse, Captain Thornton's mind was clear, his focus unwavering. The gunfire was relentless, but he knew they had to push forward. He couldn't afford to let the enemy hold their ground. "Green, take the left flank," Thornton shouted, ducking behind a stack of crates as a bullet whisked past his ear. "I'll cover the right. We're taking this place now." Green nodded and sprinted to his position while Thornton dropped to a crouch and took aim at one of the armed men advancing toward them. The man was in a suit, an odd detail that had caught Thornton's attention earlier, but now it wasn't important. What mattered was getting through this fight alive. Thornton fired, the crack of his gun echoing through the warehouse, and the man dropped to the floor, clutching his shoulder. But there was no time to celebrate the small victory. In the chaos, Tony and the bikers had joined the fray, moving with surprising speed. Tony in particular was proving to be a valuable asset. Despite his rough exterior, he had a certain kind of raw determination that made him dangerous. With a shout, Tony charged at one of the armed men, knocking him off balance and taking his gun in one fluid motion. The man, stunned, tried to pull away, but Tony had already knocked him out with a punch to the jaw. "Move, move, move," Tony shouted, tossing the gun aside and gesturing for the Royal Guards to advance. "We've got this. Let them get them." Captain Thornton, momentarily taken aback by the unexpected help, nodded grimly. "We keep pushing forward, no matter what." But as they made their way deeper into the warehouse, the sound of more footsteps came from the back. A whole new wave of enemies was approaching, and this time, they weren't just armed with guns. The door to the far end of the warehouse burst open, and a massive figure stepped into the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and armored head to toe in black gear. His helmet reflected the dim light, obscuring his face, but there was no mistaking the heavy machine gun he held in his hands. The room fell silent for a split second before the newcomer raised his weapon and began to spray the room with gunfire. The deafening roar of the machine gun filled the warehouse, and Captain Thornton's instincts kicked in. He dove to the floor, shouting for his team to take cover. The bullets tore through the air, ricocheting off steel beams and crates, sending splinters flying in every direction. The entire room seemed to explode in chaos once again, as everyone scrambled to avoid the hail of gunfire. Thornton's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed himself flat against the cold concrete, his mind racing. The armored figure who had just entered the room was like a walking tank, mowing down anything in his path. The machine gun he held was powerful, spraying bullets with an accuracy and speed that made it nearly impossible to outrun. "Green, get to the far side," Thornton shouted. "We need to flank him." But it was clear that the armored figure wasn't just here to shoot and leave. His presence alone had shifted the entire dynamic of the battle. No longer were the Royal Guards fighting only the bikers and the men in suits. They were now facing a deadly force with weapons far beyond their usual scope. The bikers who had briefly joined forces with the Royal Guards were now scattered, caught between the fire from the armored men and the men in suits. Some had taken cover behind crates, while others were crouched low to the ground, unsure of what to do next. It was clear none of them had ever faced anything like this before. Tony, still crouched behind an overturned crate, looked up at the imposing figure with wide eyes. "That's no ordinary soldier," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Who the hell are these people?" Before anyone could answer, the armored figure stopped firing momentarily, as if he was calculating his next move. The silence that followed was almost worse than the gunfire. Then, without warning, he launched himself forward, his heavy boots scuffing against the concrete floor as he charged toward Captain Thornton's position. "Get down!" Thornton shouted, pushing Green out of the way just in time as the armored figure charged past, narrowly missing them. The figure's shoulder collided with a stack of crates, sending them toppling over with a loud crash. The Royal Guards scrambled to their feet, their adrenaline pumping as they regained their footing. Thornton gritted his teeth and signaled to Green. "Take him out," he ordered. But as Green raised his weapon, the armored figure turned sharply, spinning to face them with lightning speed. A deafening clang echoed through the room as he swung a massive armored fist toward Green, knocking the rifle from his hands. Before Green could react, the figure's gloved hand shot out and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. The guards around them were frozen for a split second, unsure of what to do. Thornton's heart skipped a beat. The strength of the man, if he could even be called a man, was unreal. Green was struggling, his hands clawing at the figure's arm, but the grip was unyielding. "Green!" Thornton shouted, stepping forward, his baton raised. "Let him go!" The armored figure didn't even glance at Thornton as he slowly squeezed. Green's face turned red, his feet kicking uselessly in the air. But then, as if bored by the fight, the figure tossed Green aside like a rag doll. Green hit the floor with a sickening thud, gasping for breath, but alive. "Green!" Corporal Johnson shouted, running to his teammate's side. Thornton's pulse was racing now, his mind calculating. The man in front of them wasn't just a threat, he was a weapon, a living one. If they were going to survive this, they needed to outsmart him. "Everyone, move now!" Thornton barked, waving for the guards to spread out. "Don't let him trap us!" The Royal Guard scattered, ducking behind crates and other structures for cover. Thornton's mind raced as he tried to think of a way to deal with the behemoth standing in front of them. "Tony, you still with us?" Thornton called, hoping the biker leader was still capable of helping. Tony's voice was low but determined. "Yeah, what do you need?" Thornton didn't have time to explain. "We need to flank him. He's too strong head on. We hit him from the sides while he's distracted." "Got it," Tony replied, his voice steady but with a hint of excitement. "Let's do it." The Royal Guards and the bikers, their uneasy alliance growing stronger by the second, began to move as one. They worked quickly, carefully positioning themselves behind the crates. The armored figure, still standing in the center of the room, was scanning the area for his next target. Thornton waited, his breath shallow, his body tense. He could hear his teammates moving into position, and he knew this was their best shot. One misstep and it would all fall apart. "Now!" Thornton shouted. With a coordinated effort, both the Royal Guards and the bikers sprang into action. Thornton, with his baton raised, charged from one side while Tony and two of his crew members surged from the other. They moved in fast, each one aiming for the vulnerable points in the armored man's defense. But the figure was faster than they anticipated. He spun to face them with terrifying precision, knocking Tony aside with a swift backhand that sent him flying into a pile of crates. One of the bikers fired a shot, but the figure's armored suit absorbed the impact without a flinch. Thornton wasn't giving up. As the figure swung his fist toward him, Thornton ducked just in time, using his baton to deflect the blow and narrowly avoiding being crushed under the weight of the man's punch. It was then that Thornton noticed something. A small gap in the armored figure's side where the plating didn't quite meet. A weak spot. "Green, are you good to go?" Thornton yelled, glancing over at his corporal, who was still struggling to catch his breath, but was now on his feet again. "I'm fine, sir," Green wheezed. "I've got your back." "Get to the left, we're going to hit him at the same time," Thornton ordered, his mind already working out the strategy. Green nodded, his face grim. He picked up a nearby piece of metal, a makeshift weapon, and darted to the side, positioning himself behind a stack of crates. Thornton, with his baton in hand, moved in again, this time aiming for the weak spot on the armored man's side. But just as he was about to strike, the figure's other hand shot out and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with frightening ease. "Thornton!" Green shouted, rushing toward him, but before he could reach him, a bullet flew past Green's head, forcing him to take cover again. The armored figure's face was still obscured, but Thornton could feel the weight of his stare, cold and merciless. "You're too late," the figure said, his voice low and distorted by the helmet. "This ends now." The pressure on Thornton's throat tightened. He could feel his vision swimming, his breath becoming shallow as he struggled to break free. But then, just as everything seemed lost, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The ceiling above them began to shake as something massive hit the building with the force of a freight train. The armored figure froze for a moment, his attention diverted. Thornton, taking advantage of the distraction, grabbed the figure's wrist, twisting with all his remaining strength. The grip loosened just enough for Thornton to break free. He landed hard on the ground, gasping for air. "Now!" Thornton shouted to Green, his voice hoarse. Green rushed forward with the makeshift weapon, aiming for the weak spot in the armor. The warehouse shook again as the sound of distant engines roared closer, growing louder with every second. The ground trembled beneath them, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the warehouse. Thornton's head snapped toward the door, his instincts screaming that something far bigger than a group of armored soldiers was about to arrive. His heart raced, and the sound of approaching engines grew louder, louder still, until the air was vibrating with their power. The armored figure didn't even flinch. His gloved hand reached for his helmet, and with a sharp hiss it detached, revealing the face beneath. Captain Thornton's breath caught in his throat. The man's face wasn't what he had expected, not a hardened soldier or mercenary, but someone almost familiar. His features were sharp and angular, but it was his cold, piercing eyes that sent a shiver down Thornton's spine. "You should have stayed out of this, Captain," the man said, his voice colder than the steel surrounding them. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Thornton barely registered the words. His mind was focused on something far more pressing, the roar of engines outside. His team, still reeling from the chaotic firefight, was in no shape to face whatever was coming. "Green, move!" Thornton shouted, gesturing for his corporal to get to safety. But Green, with a look of grim determination, didn't hesitate. He lifted the heavy metal pipe in his hand and lunged at the armored figure, aiming for the weak spot in the side of the man's armor. For a moment, it seemed as though the strike might land, but the armored man sidestepped with terrifying agility, grabbing Green by the arm and throwing him across the room with brutal force. Thornton's mind raced. There was no way they could take this guy down head-on. He needed to think fast. Just as he prepared to make his move, the doors at the far end of the warehouse burst open with a deafening crash. The Royal Guards, along with the remaining bikers, turned their heads to see what could be coming next, and what came through those doors was nothing short of an assault. Massive military trucks, armored to the hilt, barreled into the warehouse, blocking the exits and surrounding the entire area. More armored soldiers poured from the vehicles, their faces obscured by combat helmets. Each one carried heavy weapons and wore tactical gear that made them look like a well-oiled machine. But what truly caught everyone's attention was the lead truck, which was emblazoned with the symbol Thornton knew all too well, the insignia of the Blackwing Mercenaries, a group known for operating in the shadows, taking on high-profile jobs for anyone with the money to pay. The leader of the mercenaries stepped forward, a tall, imposing figure with a dark visor covering his eyes. He surveyed the scene with cold indifference, his voice booming across the room. "Terminate all hostile targets," the mercenary leader ordered. The armored figure in the center of the warehouse, still holding his position, gave a slight nod. "Understood," he said in that same low, distorted voice. "Let's end this." Thorn's blood ran cold as the mercenaries began moving into position, their guns trained on the Royal Guards, the bikers, and anyone else still alive in the warehouse. The room was about to become a killing field. Outside the warehouse, the sound of roaring engines suddenly cut out. A strange silence descended upon the area, broken only by the thud of boots on concrete and the low growl of the mercenary vehicles as they moved into position. Tony, still recovering from the blow he had taken earlier, gripped his bat tightly and motioned for his bikers to stay low. They had fought in enough chaotic situations to know that this was not the time to act recklessly. They needed a plan, and fast. Tony looked at the Royal Guards, who were now backed into a corner, their numbers thinned and their morale low. They weren't just facing armed men anymore. They were up against an organized mercenary force that had come to finish the job. He glanced over at Thornton, who had his baton ready, his expression set in grim determination. "You have a plan, right?" Tony asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Thornton didn't look at him. Instead, he surveyed the area, trying to take stock of his surroundings, his mind ticking through possibilities. There was no way they could fight their way out of this without a miracle. "We need to cause a distraction," Thornton muttered, his eyes locking onto the large crates stacked along one wall. "Something to throw them off. Give us time to regroup." Tony nodded. "I'll handle the distraction. You take care of the rest." Thornton gave him a sharp look. "You're not getting in the way, understand? This is too dangerous." Tony smirked. "Dangerous? My middle name." Thornton couldn't help but let out a low chuckle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ease the tension in his chest for a brief moment. He allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The mercenaries who had spread out across the warehouse were now closing in. The armored figure still standing near the center turned to face the oncoming wave of enemies, his eyes scanning for any sign of rebellion. He wasn't worried, though. His armor was near indestructible, and his strength was beyond anything a regular man could withstand. The bikers had been fools to challenge him, and the Royal Guards were simply a minor obstacle. As the first group of mercenaries approached the Royal Guards, they began to fan out in a perfect perimeter, guns at the ready. The room felt suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in. Then, Without warning, a deafening explosion rocked the far side of the warehouse, sending a shockwave that rattled the entire building. The sound was so loud it nearly drowned out the screams of shock and the sounds of metal tearing apart. The mercenaries, startled by the explosion, immediately dove for cover, their heads swiveling toward the source of the blast. Tony stood at the far end of the warehouse, smoke rising from the wreckage of a large crate he had set on fire with a small explosive device. His grin was wide, almost manic, as he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Now's your chance, Captain," he yelled, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "Get them while they're distracted." Thornton wasted no time. He motioned for Green and the rest of the team to follow him, charging toward the mercenaries who were still trying to regain their composure. The bikers, too, took action, rushing toward the mercenaries in an attempt to break their line. But the mercenary leader quickly regained control, shouting orders to his team as they began to fight back, opening fire on anyone who dared to advance. The armored figure, seeing his opportunity, stepped forward again, raising his machine gun, ready to unleash another wave of deadly fire. Just as he began to pull the trigger, a loud bang echoed through the warehouse and the lights flickered. A shadow moved in the corner of Thornton's eye, a figure slipping silently through the darkness. Before the armored figure could react, something heavy collided with the back of his helmet, sending him stumbling forward. The machine gun went off with a deafening roar, but the shot went wild, ricocheting off a metal beam and splintering the nearby crates. The armored figure spun around, but the shadowy figure was already gone, lost in the smoke and confusion. "Who the hell was that?" the mercenary leader growled, his eyes scanning the room. He was no fool. Someone was playing games with them, and it wasn't Tony or the Royal Guards. But before he could give another order, the ground shook again. This time, it wasn't an explosion. It was a much more dangerous arrival. The sound of approaching engines grew louder once more, but this time it wasn't from any truck or military vehicle. The unmistakable roar of a powerful bike engine filled the room. Thornton's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. Tony's eyes widened. No way! A lone figure on a sleek black motorcycle came tearing through the warehouse doors, skidding to a stop in the middle of the chaos. The rider, dressed in all black, removed their helmet to reveal a familiar face. Captain Thornton's mouth went dry. It was his old partner, Sergeant Hayes. The moment Sergeant Hayes's helmet came off, the room seemed to freeze, the air thick with tension, the noise of gunfire and shouting falling silent for just a heartbeat as everyone turned to look at her. Sergeant Hayes was a figure from Thornton's past, a ghost of sorts. She had disappeared years ago under strange circumstances, and no one had heard from her since. No one knew if she was dead, gone rogue, or something else entirely. The fact that she was here now, on the battlefield with a motorcycle and a clear purpose, sent a jolt of shock through Thornton's system. Her short cropped hair was darker than he remembered, her expression cold but focused. She glanced around the room, her gaze locking onto Thornton for a moment. "I'm not here to make friends, Captain," she said, her voice steady, almost too calm for the chaos surrounding them. "But it looks like you need a hand." Thornton opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form the words, Hayes was already in motion. She reached down to the side of her motorcycle, pulling out a high-powered sniper rifle that had been strapped to the back. Without hesitation, she took a knee, lined up her shot, and fired. The first shot hit the armored figure square in the chest, sending a shockwave through the warehouse as the heavy armor absorbed the impact. The figure staggered but didn't go down. "Not enough," Hayes muttered, reloading the rifle with smooth, practiced motions. "Gotta aim for the joints." Tony, who had been staring at Hayes in disbelief, snapped to action. "Now's your chance," he yelled at Thornton, waving his hand at the mercenaries who were still regrouping. Thornton didn't need to be told twice. He signaled to Green and the other Royal Guards to advance, and they charged forward, taking advantage of the mercenaries' confusion. The bikers followed close behind, their weapons drawn, ready to hit hard while the mercenaries were distracted by Hayes's sniper fire. The mercenary leader, visibly rattled, barked orders to his men, trying to regain control. But Hayes's shots kept coming, each one hitting closer and closer to the vulnerable joints in the armored figure's suit. The once unstoppable soldier was slowing down, the suit's power seemingly draining with each shot. "Keep it up, Hayes," Thornton yelled, pushing forward. "We've got to finish this." Just as Hayes took another shot, the armored figure finally stumbled. His knee buckled under him, and he fell to one knee. It was the break they needed. Thornton sprinted forward, using the chaos as cover, and reached the fallen soldier just as Hayes lined up another shot. "Now!" Thornton shouted. With precision and speed, Thornton dove into the fray, landing a powerful strike to the armored figure's side, just below the joint Hayes had targeted. The man let out a strangled grunt, his armor dented and cracked from the impact. He tried to raise his gun, but his movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. Hayes's final shot rang out, hitting the weak point in the suit right behind the knee joint, and the armored man collapsed completely. His heavy armor clattered to the floor with a metallic thud, and the warehouse fell eerily silent for a moment. The mercenaries, unsure of how to respond, hesitated. Their leader, now furious and visibly sweating, turned to face Hayes, who was already reloading her sniper rifle, unflinching. "Who are you working for?" the mercenary leader demanded, his voice a low growl. "You've no idea what you've just started." Hayes smirked, standing up slowly, her weapon still trained on him. "I'm working for myself, if that's what you're asking," she said, her tone dripping with confidence. "And right now, I'm working for you to be the next one on the ground." The mercenary leader's eyes narrowed and his hand shot to the side, signaling for his men to advance. But before they could react, another explosion shook the warehouse, this one coming from the back of the room. The entire wall seemed to cave in, sending debris flying in every direction. The explosion wasn't from the Royal Guards or the bikers, it was something far bigger. Outside the warehouse, a massive armored convoy had arrived, its vehicles covered in camouflage and marked with the insignia of a force even more dangerous than the Blackwing mercenaries. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were an elite tactical team, known as the Shadow Legion. The very sight of their vehicles, with their blacked-out windows and powerful armored plating, sent a chill through everyone watching. The Shadow Legion had a reputation for being ruthless, precise, and entirely unpredictable. And they had come to finish what the mercenaries started. "Move! Move! Move!" shouted a voice from one of the vehicles as the Shadow Legion soldiers poured into the warehouse with military precision. They were armed with the latest weapons, and their movements were synchronized, each soldier covering a different angle of attack as they entered the fray. The Royal Guards, who had barely begun to regroup, found themselves under a new barrage of fire. The bikers, who had been caught in the chaos, were now scrambling for cover, unsure of who they could trust in this rapidly escalating battle. Thornton's pulse quickened as he saw the Shadow Legion soldiers closing in on them. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. They were no longer dealing with mercenaries. They were up against the most feared Black Ops unit in the world. "Thornton!" Hayes shouted, her sniper rifle in hand as she ducked behind a stack of crates. "We need to get out of here. This is way beyond what we can handle." But there was no time to retreat. The Shadow Legion was everywhere, their rifles trained on any moving target. Thornton glanced at his team. Green was down behind cover. Tony was rallying his bikers. But the odds were quickly stacking up against them. The mercenaries were still alive, their leader now barking orders to his remaining men to regroup. Hayes' sharp eyes caught sight of a nearby control panel hidden beneath some rubble. Without thinking, she grabbed Thornton by the arm. "Trust me," she said urgently, dragging him toward the panel. "If we can hit this, we might be able to disable their comms. It'll give us a shot at getting out of here alive." Thornton hesitated for a moment. They were pinned down and time was running out. The Shadow Legion was closing in. "Do it," Thornton said, his voice hard and resolute. "We'll cover you." Hayes dropped to her knees in front of the panel, quickly working her way through the wires with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the air, but Hayes was completely focused, her hands moving in swift, practiced motions. "You've got 5 seconds," she called out, not looking up. Thornton motioned for Green to cover her while he took a position, his baton raised, ready for anything. The tension was palpable as the seconds ticked by. Outside, the sound of the approaching Shadow Legion vehicles grew louder, and Thornton knew they didn't have much time. "Almost there," Hayes muttered. The seconds stretched, the air thick with anticipation, and then, with a satisfying click, the control panel sparked to life. The entire warehouse seemed to pulse with energy as the lights flickered, then went completely dark. The Shadow Legion soldiers halted, confused by the sudden blackout. It was their moment. The darkness was absolute. For a split second, the world inside the warehouse seemed to stop. No lights, no sound except for the heavy breathing of the Royal Guards, the bikers and the mercenaries, all of them standing in a strange, tense stillness. The only light now came from the faint glow of emergency exit signs at the far edges of the warehouse, their eerie red illumination casting long, unsettling shadows across the chaos. Hayes, kneeling by the control panel, looked up, her eyes narrowed in the near-complete darkness. "Got it," she whispered, a trace of satisfaction in her voice. Thornton, still crouched behind the nearest stack of crates, shot a quick look at Green. "Move now," he ordered. "We need to use the cover of this blackout. Push them back." Green nodded grimly. His hand tightened around his weapon as he peeked around the corner, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "This is our chance," he muttered. Without waiting for further instructions, Thornton bolted from his position, sprinting toward the far side of the warehouse where the mercenaries had started to regroup. His legs burned with the effort, but there was no time to waste. The Shadow Legion would be back online any second, and when they did, they'd be even more dangerous. Behind him, Hayes stood and gave one final check to the control panel, making sure the power remained out. The warehouse stayed silent, but she knew it wouldn't last. "Go, go!" Hayes shouted, already on her feet and running toward the mercenaries' rear flank. She used the shadows to her advantage, moving with a kind of deadly precision only someone like her could muster. Thornton and Green moved in tandem, each one aware of the other's movements, covering each other's backs. They had worked together in the past, and now, in the face of overwhelming odds, that experience paid off. They moved quietly but with purpose, taking out the mercenaries in a coordinated attack. One of the mercenaries tried to raise his weapon, but Green was faster, his knee driving into the man's chest before he could pull the trigger. The soldier crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the floor. Thornton, meanwhile, was dealing with another mercenary who had just rounded a corner, his gun raised, but Thornton anticipated his move, stepping into the soldier's path and knocking the weapon aside with his baton. A quick jab to the gut and a well-placed elbow to the jaw sent the man sprawling. The darkness worked in their favor, but it wouldn't last. The mercenaries were regrouping and slowly starting to make sense of the situation. The silence wouldn't last forever. Thornton heard the telltale click of a radio being turned back on. The Shadow Legion was regaining their coordination. It was only a matter of time before they started searching for the intruders. Then, just as they reached the far end of the warehouse, a familiar voice came crackling through the air. "Thornton, you're out of time." The voice was cold, calm, and eerily familiar. Thornton's heart sank. The mercenary leader had regained control. Even worse, he had somehow re-established communication with the Shadow Legion. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore, it was a trap. Outside, the convoy of Shadow Legion vehicles was waiting. The sound of boots on the pavement was now unmistakable, as a full team of Shadow Legion soldiers began to swarm the perimeter of the warehouse, cutting off every potential escape route. Their movement was deliberate, practiced, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They were preparing to enter from every side, systematically closing in on their prey. Tony, who had been helping to cover the Royal Guard's retreat, looked at his bikers, his expression hardening. "Have to make a choice," he muttered under his breath. "We either fight our way out, or we make our last stand." The bikers, once hesitant and unsure, now understood the gravity of the situation. Some of them began pulling out their guns, ready to take on whatever was coming, but Tony held up a hand, signaling them to hold their fire. "Not yet," he said. "Wait for the signal." Tony wasn't afraid. He had seen worse than this. But even he knew that facing the Shadow Legion head-on would be a death sentence for them all. Back inside, the mercenary leader's voice crackled through the comms again. "You're making a mistake, Thornton. We know who you are, you know who we are. You can't outrun us, and you certainly can't fight us. Surrender now, and maybe we'll make this quick." Thornton clenched his jaw. There was no way he was giving in, not now, not when they were this close to taking control of the situation. "I don't think so," he said under his breath, staring into the darkness. "We're not done yet." He motioned for Green to cover him as he moved toward the entrance, trying to gauge how many mercenaries were still in the area. The silence was almost suffocating now, the tension unbearable. Then, just as he was about to give the order to regroup, a single bright beam of light pierced the darkness. The overhead lights flickered to life once again, illuminating the entire warehouse. For a brief moment, Thornton was blinded by the sudden light, his eyes squinting against the harsh glare. Then, as his vision adjusted, he realized what had happened. The Shadow Legion had activated a secondary power grid, an emergency backup to keep their operations running smoothly even in a blackout. Thornton didn't have time to process it. He dove for cover as the sound of gunfire erupted from the far side of the warehouse. The Shadow Legion soldiers had made their move. "Move out," the mercenary leader ordered, his voice booming through the warehouse. "We have them cornered! Don't let them escape!" Thornton, still crouched behind a pile of debris, watched as the soldiers moved toward the center, their weapons raised, ready to eliminate any threat. The fight was on. Tony saw the Shadow Legion soldiers entering from all sides, their movements crisp and well-coordinated. The bikers, their faces set in grim determination, prepared to make their stand. Tony gave the signal, and all at once, they opened fire. The warehouse exploded in a flurry of bullets, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning metal. The bikers, though not trained soldiers, fought with the raw intensity of those who had nothing left to lose. They used the environment to their advantage, ducking behind crates and barrels, firing when they could. But the Shadow Legion wasn't like any opponent they had faced before. They moved like a well-oiled machine, clearing rooms and neutralizing threats with chilling efficiency. Every corner Tony tried to hide behind was already covered by a soldier, every position already calculated. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Back inside the warehouse, Thornton's team was in full retreat. The Royal Guards, battered but not broken, fought their way back toward the door. Hayes covered their escape, picking off any soldier who dared to approach with her sniper rifle. The Shadow Legion soldiers, relentless and precise, were closing in from all directions. There was no way out, no exit they could reach before the walls came crashing down around them. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Thornton spotted something that could change everything. A large steel door hidden behind a stack of crates was slightly ajar. The light from the emergency grid illuminated it, just enough for him to see the faint outline of a potential escape route. But it was heavily guarded. Thornton's eyes locked onto the door, his mind racing. There was no time to hesitate. They had one shot at this. He motioned for Green and Hayes to cover him. "That's our way out," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "On my mark, we move. No looking back." And then, with a final breath, he sprinted toward the door, the sounds of gunfire and chaos echoing behind him. But would they make it out alive? The moment Thornton broke for the steel door, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. He could hear the muffled roar of gunfire behind him, the cries of battle, the relentless footsteps of the Shadow Legion soldiers advancing from all directions. But he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. His mind was laser-focused on the door ahead, his one chance at escape. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted, the sound of his own footsteps the only thing he could hear in the chaos behind him. Hayes and Green provided cover, laying down suppressive fire as best they could. Hayes, her sniper rifle in hand, picked off a soldier who tried to flank them from the left. Green, his expression grim, fired his sidearm at any mercenary who dared to get too close. They were running out of time. Thornton reached the door in a flash, his hand slamming into the cold metal as he yanked it open. The narrow passage beyond was dark, the air thick with the smell of old rust and decay. It wasn't much, but it was their only shot. "Move!" Thornton shouted, beckoning for his team to follow. Green was the first to join him, moving swiftly into the shadows of the tunnel. Hayes followed, but not before taking one last look over her shoulder, her sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. "Come on, Hayes," Thornton urged, already halfway down the passage. Hayes hesitated, then fired one last shot at an approaching mercenary before slamming the door shut behind them with a heavy clang. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that comes after a storm. The noise of the battle outside was muffled, and the echo of their footsteps in the tunnel was the only sound that filled the air. They moved quickly through the dark passage, the concrete walls pressing in around them. Thornton's mind raced. They had no idea where this tunnel would lead, or if it even connected to an exit. They had just one chance to make it out alive. If they didn't find another way out soon, they'd be trapped between two enemies. The Shadow Legion on one side, the Blackwing mercenaries on the other. The passage twisted and turned, each step deeper into the unknown, but Thornton had been in worse situations. This wasn't over yet. Back outside the warehouse, the battle raged on. The mercenaries and Shadow Legion soldiers had locked in on the bikers now, fighting for their lives just to hold their ground. Tony, grimly setting his jaw, was still in the thick of it. "Don't let them get away," the mercenary leader shouted, his voice filled with fury. "Get the Royal Guards, now!" But Tony, surrounded by his remaining bikers, wasn't about to give up. "Keep fighting," he yelled, aiming his gun at an oncoming soldier. "We'll take as many of them down as we can." He had no illusions about survival, but they had one goal: keep the enemy distracted long enough for Thornton and his team to get away. And for that, they'd need to fight with everything they had left. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but it only seemed to fuel Tony's resolve. He fired back, not knowing if he'd make it out of this. He didn't care. The bikers, bloodied and bruised, fought with a raw intensity, desperate to hold their ground. Meanwhile, in the tunnel, the Royal Guards were moving swiftly. The walls seemed to close in around them as they pushed forward, the damp air getting colder the deeper they went. Thornton's senses were on high alert, listening for any sounds that might signal an incoming threat, but so far the tunnel remained eerily silent. "Do you think they're still following us?" Green asked, his voice low but steady. "I don't know," Thornton replied, "but we can't risk waiting around to find out." Suddenly, a faint light flickered at the end of the passage. Thornton's heart skipped a beat. Could it be an exit? He increased his pace, signaling for Green and Hayes to follow. They moved faster now, their footsteps echoing as they neared the end. Then, as they rounded a corner and the light became clearer, it was coming from a set of heavy metal doors. Doors that appeared to be the kind used in secure military installations. "The door—" "That's got to be it," Thornton muttered. "We're getting out." But just as they reached the doors, they heard the unmistakable sound of boots in the distance. The Shadow Legion had found the tunnel. "Go," Thornton ordered, his hand already on the door's handle. With a quick shove, the door opened with a heavy creak. Beyond it, there was a narrow alley lit by the faint glow of streetlights. The sound of gunfire and shouting seemed distant now, but they knew it wasn't over. "At the back," Hayes said, pointing toward the alley that led to a nearby street. "We need to keep moving." They were moments away from freedom, but as they stepped into the alley, the unmistakable roar of engines filled the air. The heavy rumble of approaching vehicles echoed down the street, getting louder with each passing second. Thornton's eyes narrowed. No, not now, not when they were so close. But as the vehicles emerged from the shadows, Thornton saw something that made his heart drop. A convoy of trucks, black, armored, and bristling with weapons. It was the Blackwing mercenaries. They had been one step ahead of them all along. Thornton gritted his teeth, his mind racing. "We're not going down without a fight." Hayes was already assessing the situation. "We need to get to cover. If we can hit one of their trucks, it'll buy us enough time to escape." Green nodded, looking at the alleyways ahead. "We can't go back now. We either fight or we die here." Thornton gave them a firm nod. "Then let's fight." The next moments were a blur. The Royal Guards, despite their exhaustion, formed a defensive line, their backs to the wall, ready for whatever came next. They could hear the engines approaching, the sound of heavy military trucks grinding against the pavement. The Shadow Legion soldiers, now positioned around them, readied their weapons. Then, without warning, the first truck came into view, barreling down the street toward them. Thornton was about to give the order to open fire when, from the far end of the alley, a single shot rang out. The truck swerved violently to the side, its front tires blown out by a well-placed sniper shot. The convoy screeched to a halt. The mercenaries, startled, scrambled to respond, but before they could react, another figure emerged from the shadows. It was Tony, on his motorcycle. He wasn't alone. Several of the remaining bikers followed him, their guns raised as they charged the mercenaries and Shadow Legion soldiers, distracting them just long enough for Thornton's team to make their move. "Go, go, go!" Tony shouted, weaving in and out of traffic, his motorcycle roaring through the chaos. With no time to waste, Thornton and Hayes pushed forward, darting into the street, their weapons raised. The mercenaries and Shadow Legion soldiers were scattered, disoriented, caught off guard by the unexpected reinforcements. The bikers fought fiercely, holding their ground even as the trucks continued to burn. But it was clear this wasn't a victory they could sustain for long. "We're not out of the woods yet," Thornton said, his voice tight. "We need to move fast." They ran as fast as they could through the now broken city streets, with Tony and the bikers providing cover. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they had a chance to breathe. For the first time in days, they were alive, and that was all that mattered. The fight wasn't over, but they had won the first round. As the sound of engines faded into the distance and the adrenaline finally began to wear off, Thornton looked at his team, his Royal Guards, his old partner Hayes, and even Tony and the bikers who had become unlikely allies. There was a long road ahead, but together they had survived, and together they would face whatever came next.